For several weeks now, the Turkish government has been carrying out a savage assault on sections of its own population. The Kurdish regions in eastern Turkey have been under heavy fire on the orders of the Turkish government. Many Kurdish people have been killed, curfews have been imposed on cities, and given that Turkey is a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, it is surprising, or is it, that there has barely been any coverage of these massacres and attacks in the Western media, and certainly nothing in the media outlets of the NATO countries. So there are two rules. One rule for the enemies of NATO and another rule for the friends of NATO. When they behave in this fashion, they are largely ignored. The Kurdish people of Turkey have been under attack for many decades now. With me today to discuss these matters is Giran Ozjani, a member of the Kurdish National Congress. Giran, welcome. Tell me first, what are the origins of the immediate crisis that is confronting the Kurdish people in Turkey? What triggered it off? Why did Erdogan decide on this option?
Well, if we take the immediate situation, independent from the historical context that it derives of, we can say that this current process started with the June elections in Turkey of 2015. In that election, the HDP won a surprising number of votes and passed the 10% threshold put in place to actually avoid Kurds from being represented in the Turkish parliament. Now, when the HDP did pass that threshold, the AKP government had been ruling in Turkey, but they were in government for such a long time that were unable to digest the fact that now with the HDP in parliament, they did not have a majority.
They lost their majority.
They had lost their majority and were unable to form government. This was the first time since the AKP took power that they had lost majority and were unable to form government. Well, Erdogan himself actually declared that there would be a re-election on the 1st of November. So the initial hatred towards the Kurds for this current process came from this election. This was a big blow to the AKP's ambitions of hegemonizing power in Turkey. Only a month after the June 7 election loss of the AKP government, the attack started with direct attacks to civilians. So we had the bombings of Suruç, for example, in which 33 young civilians, young students mostly, died who were trying to cross the border to Kobani to help in the rebuilding effort of the city that was under siege by ISIS only 6 or 7 months prior. The Turkish government had blamed ISIS for this attack. ISIS never owned up to this attack, but the Turkish government kept saying that this was ISIS. Now, this raised questions in itself. This was a direct attack against the very people that supported the HDP. The young people there were from organizations that take place in the HDP, which is a wide coalition of progressive people in Turkey. And these people were particularly targeted because they were the ones that blocked the AKP from being able to form government. They're the ones who dealt them the election loss. As soon as Suruç happened, a few days after, the Turkish army directly started bombarding PKK positions. So directly started targeting the dynamic behind the election loss, but also the main force fighting ISIS in both Syria and Iraq. So they were attacking civilians, and now they were attacking the PKK also. And the summer went by with a bloody war. The war was reignited. The peace process had ended in the spring, but the war started after the June 7 election loss. So this started in the summer as well, a couple of months before the actual Ankara attack. And then who was attacked in Ankara? Again, it was the very organizations and institutions that supported the HDP in that election.
Has anything been discovered about the perpetrators of the attack on the Ankara demonstration?
Yes, because this is, I mean, all propaganda to aside, this is an internal issue for Turkey. And there are people that are asking questions because they want to live in a safe country. How these are people that are known to the security services and how they can still walk about freely in cities such as Ankara, only a couple of kilometers away from the Turkish Secret Services headquarters. How they can detonate such a huge bomb, such a devastating attack in the heart of the country. I mean, even the Prime Minister came out and said, yes, these people were on our list, but we just didn't believe that they would carry out such attacks. I mean, this came out of the Prime Minister's mouth in Turkey. So there's maybe no direct implications, but there is an outstanding amount of evidence that actually shows that the Turkish government was at the very least turned a blind eye, at the very least.
But you know, there are also reports that the Turkish government at various stages, because of its intervention in Syria, has been opening the roads for ISIS to cross. They've been de facto collaborating with ISIS. So a number of my Turkish sources say it is not impossible that sections of the Turkish secret state actually knew about these attacks, even though officially they're saying that the people were on our list, but we didn't know.
So we know their links on the ground because in Rojava, in Syrian Kurdistan, Kurdish fighters have been fighting against ISIS for 3 or 4 years. And they have directly experienced the contact between the Turkish government and ISIS on the ground. Border gates that were controlled by ISIS were open. But as soon as the Kurds defeated ISIS in those very border regions, those border gates were closed off to the Kurds. So this, for us, this is evidence. This we may not be able to convince the international community, those that have financial, economical, political, geopolitical contacts with Turkey. We might not be able to convince them, but for us, this is evidence that
well, the international community is effectively the United States, and in fact, I have little doubt that their intelligence agencies, the CIA, the DIA, are perfectly well aware of what's going on. I mean, Seymour Hersh recently has published an article in which he says that sections of the Pentagon, Defense Intelligence Agency, were extremely worried at turning a blind eye to ISIS, as the State Department and the CIA were doing. So even within the American establishment, a debate has opened up on this. But Giran, let's get back to this assault on the Kurds. There has been hardly any coverage in the Western media of this. So describe to me what exactly has been going on in terms of assaults, killings, deaths. What is going on now?
Now, right now, we can see tanks, Turkish tanks, in Kurdish towns in Turkey. There are
in all the Kurdish towns?
Not in all the Kurdish towns. There are the curfews that have been declared. The fighting has been primarily based in the southeast corner of Turkey. Largely specific in the districts in 3 cities. Now,
which cities?
Diyarbakir, Shirnak, and Mardin are 3 Kurdish cities in the southeast of Turkey. There have been several other districts that have gone through periods of curfews, but primarily this is where the atrocities of the Turkish government are based today. I mean, we've had babies killed by snipers. We've had tanks shelling homes in which mothers and their children have been eating. Artillery fire straight from tanks that have exploded in people's living rooms. There's been images of these, there's been videos of these. I mean, it's reminiscent of what's going on in other places in the Middle East, even worse than what's going on in other places in the Middle East, and yet you say, yes, the international community is completely turning a blind eye. I mean those states that have an interest and an economic and geopolitical contact with the Turkish state. But what's going on in Turkey today is probably worse right now than what was happening in Syria in 2010 and 2011. So who is it that decides that in one country there's a civil war, but in Turkey, you know, it's okay to turn a blind eye to? Which powers is it that decide that The very same thing that was going on in Syria is completely different to what's going on in Turkey. In Turkey, you have the state who are purposefully oppressing, suppressing, and massacring a people just because that very people won in an election.
So you think that the main aim of the Erdogan's offensive against the Kurdish people is to destroy the Kurds as a political force in Turkey?
Absolutely, yes, because the Kurds as a political force are a thorn in the side of Turkish political aspirations, not only in Turkey, but in other parts of the Middle East. The Kurds, they are not just fighting or struggling for cultural recognition. This is one part of it. This is national liberation is one part of the Kurdish struggle. The Kurds are an ideological force as well. It's not just about liberating the Kurds.
It's social liberation.
Exactly. It's socialism. When the United States approaches the Kurds, it is able to differentiate which Kurds it wants to approach. So a responsibility falls on all of us as progressives to see which Kurds are fighting for what. Can we categorize the Kurds as a whole? Can we say that the Kurdish people, this is their agenda and this is what they're doing, this is what they're struggling for? Or do we have to sit and say, well, 1 minute, no, there are Kurds that are struggling for their cultural rights, but also for an alternative model of liberation, an alternative model for the way to live life, for the way to construct a new society. This is what's happening in Kurdistan.
And you know, the other thing which one shouldn't forget, and in fact it should be stressed, is that sometimes when the Kurds are represented in the Western media, they are seen essentially as brave fighters in the mountains, in their enclaves, you know, cut off but very courageous and noble. But in fact, this is rubbish, because Istanbul, for instance, I mean, the figures are debated, but it could be 50%, certainly 40% of the population of Istanbul is Kurdish, or of Kurdish origin. So they are well integrated in the urban life of the large cities in Turkey, or for that matter, Iraq. Etc. They're not just people who can be sealed off in the enclaves.
Definitely. I mean,
now, what do you think is going to be the outcome of this civil war that has been unleashed by Erdogan?
Well, the Kurdish people have been resisting actively in Turkey for the past 40 years. However, the Kurds have lots of experience in resisting. A government like Erdogan's government, or even worse governments in Turkey's history.
The military dictatorship.
Exactly. Kurds are experienced in resisting against this.
So there is resistance going on.
There is definitely resistance going on. But the main thing here is that the Kurds are not resisting just for the sake of resistance. They have an agenda. They have an ambition, an aspiration of what kind of society they want to construct and what kind of model they want to implement. And they're resisting towards this ambition. So they are resisting against an oppressive regime, but they know what they want to replace it as well. So while there is this resistance, there's also, parallel to this, a construction of an alternative model for society. There are, in the regions that are right now barricaded and under siege by the Turkish army, in the very same places, you can see that while people from all ages, women and men, from the ages of 15 to 65, are actively resisting against the army, but also they're sitting down and forming their communes. They're sitting down and forming their neighborhood assemblies to be able to organize life in those very horrific conditions. So the two go hand in hand. The Kurdish people are not only in resistance, they're actively in taking part in the construction of their ideal society.
What can be said about the rest of Turkish civil society at the moment? What has been the response, say, from people in Istanbul who have been very courageous in the past?
I mean, progressive forces in Turkey and the civil society movements in Turkey are aware of what the AKP is trying to do, are aware of what Erdogan is trying to do. Some certain laws were passed and people were, the left, the liberals of the country were hopeful that Erdogan might change certain things. But lately, in the last 5 or 6 years especially, I think people realized what he was actually trying to do, which was to consolidate his grasp on power in Turkey. So then, I mean, as you know, the Gezi uprisings broke out, and this was anger at what the AKP and Erdogan were trying to change in the country. They were trying to enforce their own lifestyles on the people. They were trying,
and on all the people.
On all the people, yes. And people finally realized that yes, Erdogan, no, he's not progressive. He's not doing these to be progressive. And so it is time to resist against this government. And the Gezi uprisings were the practical result of this anger.
But you know, just to stop you for a minute, there are misconceptions even about those uprisings. People think that they only happen in Istanbul or Ankara because these were the most reported. What is usually missed out, that these uprisings took place in all the major and some not so major cities in Turkey. The first sign, if you like, of open mass opposition to the regime, which must have frightened them. I mean, you can see that Erdogan, who always had paranoid symptoms, but after these occupations and movements in Turkey, he became completely defensive and completely paranoid, seeing enemies everywhere, stopping newspapers, arresting journalists.
Definitely. I mean, you can see this just from where people were killed during the Gezi protests. I mean, they weren't all killed in Istanbul. There was people killed in Hatay, which is in south of Turkey. There were people killed in Eskişehir. So just looking at where people were targeted, you can see that this was an uprising throughout the whole of Turkey. What the aspiration for the HDP was to unify people that were oppressed across the scale. So from LGBT movements to leftist movements to ecological movements to the Kurdish movement, to unify the people that were oppressed by the very same system. Now, although electorally this worked, it can be said that on the ground in civil society movements, this unity probably isn't at the level that it should be. Right now, the Kurds have been resisting for the past 40 years. Now, this resistance is against the state. It's against what the AKP stand for. It's against Erdogan's mentality. Now, I would say that this has to be seen across the whole of Turkey. This is not a Kurdish resistance. This is resistance against the oppression of the AKP and Erdogan. Now, if that wants to be overcome, then at one point, this resistance and this common threat has to be dealt with. And this is what maybe the civil society movements in Turkey need to see pretty quickly.
But the way Erdogan is behaving is to make sort of democratic functioning virtually impossible at the moment. You know, when you have journalists charged with treason, and journalists not from left-wing papers, but from mainstream papers like Cumhuriyet, being arrested, being threatened, copies of the papers being seized before they can be distributed, surely something has got to happen.
Well, I mean, right now in Turkey, there is no such thing as a constitution. The constitution is completely, I mean, it's just a piece of paper right now because Erdogan has been able to dysfunctionalize all the institutions that uphold the constitution. So he has an agenda of changing the administrative system in Turkey to a unitary presidential system. However, he's already done this. Now, there's all this talk about whether it should happen.
But he's done it de facto.
De facto, this is what's going on right now.
Now, what about the elements who used to be in the AKP, but then fell out with Erdogan, the supporters of Gulen, the cleric who's based in the United States? They split with Erdogan. What is there? Do they still have people in the armed forces, the police, the judiciary? Or have they been purged?
This was a classic example of an internal power struggle. So it was a classic example of power sharing, but just a lack of sharing. So when they actually engulfed the whole country, all institutions, all bureaucratic institutions were under their control. So the Fethullah Gulen and AKP movements, they were partners. They were active partners up until only 3 years ago. What changed was that now that power was consolidated. They took control of the army, the security service, everything. The judiciary was completely under their control, but it was too much to share now. And this is why the breakout was horrific. I mean, so as the Kurdish movement, for example, in this kind of struggle, we could not pick sides because, I mean, they're both different faces of the same coin.
Yeah. Iran, let's go back to Kurdish history. 100 years ago, when the victorious imperial powers had defeated Ottoman Turkey and were setting up states all over the place, creating these states which they are now trying to break up again in the Middle East, there was a perfect rational possibility that a Kurdish state could have been created, uniting the Kurdish people in Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Iran. I mean, you can see the belt. Yet they decided not to do that for reasons of their own, which were geopolitical reasons. They didn't want to divide these states at the time, etc., etc. And then for a long time in the rest of the 20th century, there was a real hope that a Kurdish nation might yet come into existence through social and national liberation, armed struggle. That period has now gone. And as you said, the Kurdish nation itself now is divided. The Iraqi Kurds behave in a completely different way. The Syrians, the Turks behave in a different way. The Iranian Kurdish movement has relatively been more passive. So what is the future for the idea of a Kurdistan? A, and secondly, the Turkish PKK has abandoned the idea of independence and wants to build a federal Turkey with unifying the Kurdish people with the other sections of the community, etc.
Well, let me start from here. I, for one, am grateful that the powers that divided the Middle East almost 100 years ago didn't decide to create a Kurdish state.
Why?
Yes, because I mean, this is maybe more of a personal opinion, but I, for one, am very happy that my heritage or my country was not added or joined to the ambitions of the imperialists at that time. Now, when we come to today, we're at another conjuncture in which decisions are being made again about which nation states or which countries or which people now will be joined to this imperialist project. And now, this is why the internal Kurdish politics is very important for anyone who wants to think about what's going on in the Middle East. Because there are people in Kurdistan, there are Kurds that wouldn't mind to become the imperialist representation in the Middle East.
Out of an Israeli-American
Definitely.
protectorate.
These are they're a tiny minority of people, but they are worth taking notice of because these are the people that the USA and Israel want to show as representatives of the Kurds, but they are not. They're a minority. The majority of the Kurds are supporting a project called Democratic Confederalism, which was proposed by the PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan. And what does this mean? Kurds do want independence, but they believe that forming a state doesn't make you independent.
So they want full autonomy.
Definitely. I mean, they want autonomy for the people, not autonomy for an elite group to form their own state. So it is a theoretical question in itself also. But the Kurdish project is forming independence of the people from the state. So having people to run their own affairs themselves. So we don't want boundaries, for example, in the region. I, for one, wouldn't want a Kurdistan carved up with fences around it to form a new nation state with boundaries. No, but what I would want is existing boundaries to be removed because they were drawn up by people that don't know much about the cultural substance of the region. I mean, you can see all those straight lines in the Middle East.
Yeah, no,
I mean,
I agree with you.
So
I remember I was quite shocked when I was in Diyarbakir in, I think, 2004 or 3, I can't remember, during the war in Iraq. Well, the war in Iraq is still going on, but at the high point of the US occupation. And I gave a talk at the big cultural center, and to my horror, large numbers of mainly young people, not the older generation, didn't oppose the war. And when I asked why, we had a long debate. It was a two and a half hour session. And underneath it, there lay a feeling that Iraqi Kurdistan is virtually independent, that we are going there and seeing how they are functioning. And I said, yeah, but Iraqi Kurdistan has effectively been a US protectorate now for 10 years. So, you know, it functions in a different way. And many people said, but what's wrong with being a US Israeli protectorate? We don't care as long as we become it. And I said, the Americans are never going to give that to you. You're based in Turkey. You're part of a state which is eastern pillar of NATO, and they're not going to abandon the Turkish army for you, so forget it. And later I got many emails saying you were right. But there was this sentiment there, Giran, which really was frightening.
Well, nationalism in itself is a sentiment or is an ideology that is able to exploit
Justify anything.
That sentiment specifically, because people do want to administer themselves. People do not want to be attached. They don't want to be colonized, firstly. But the question arises, I mean, how ideologically aware is everyone? This is the question that will decide Kurdistan's future right now, because there is an organization that is openly anti-imperialist and that is struggling in all 4 parts of Kurdistan and who has overwhelming popular support.
In all parts of
all parts of Kurdistan. And
including Iraq?
Including Iraq, yes. I mean, in Iraq, it's funny because political parties or organizations affiliated to the PKK aren't allowed the liberty to work and conduct their political work in southern Kurdistan, which is northern Iraq. They don't have that freedom. I mean, it's funny in the sense that the HDP, which the Turkish government openly says is the political wing of the PKK, is still able to enter elections and is still able to conduct its political work in Turkey. But in northern Iraq, southern Kurdistan, the authorities, the KDP specifically, does not allow for institutions or political parties that it believes are affiliated to the PKK to work in southern Kurdistan. But I myself, I've been to South Kurdistan, and you can see a sympathy towards what the PKK is doing, because it was the PKK that came down from its headquarters in Kandil Mountains to protect Sinjar from ISIS. It was the PKK that came down to protect Kirkuk from ISIS. So there is a sympathy in southern Iraq also, definitely.
Giran, what message would you give to people in South America or elsewhere who watch this, that the need really is for maximum solidarity?
This is what I would want the people of South America to know, that in Kurdistan there is an unbelievable energy to resist, but there's also a practical model where that energy is able to show itself in the alternative construction of society. There is an anti-imperialist struggle that is supported by millions. There is an alternative model that is being constructed as we speak, while resisting against the atrocities of states like Turkey and ISIS. In Rojava, in northern Syria, and in Turkey, neighborhood assemblies are being formed, women's assemblies are being formed. There are women fighting, resisting, and constructing that alternative society in towns in Turkey, in northern Kurdistan, and in other places in Kurdistan. So the people of South America, I would love for them to be able to know that there is a hope in the Middle East also. There are lots of struggling peoples and organizations in South America, but they should know that there are struggling people in the Middle East too that have anti-imperialist agendas and that are progressing towards constructing that alternative model of society.
Giran, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.